Hello, hello, Barnes& and Noble Book Club. It is really great to have everyone in the same virtual space again. I'm here with my colleague in all things books, Lexie Smyth,
Hello, everyone.
and of course, the dude of the hour, Leif Enger. I Cheerfully Refuse was our April book club pick, and I just want to remind everyone, tiny bit of housekeeping, there will be spoilers in this conversation. If you listen to the interview that I did with Leif on Poured Over, there were no spoilers. We were so good. We were so good not to let anything slip. In fact, we were talking about it before we turned on this set of faces for you guys today. So just remember there are spoilers. If you gave us a question when you registered for the event on Eventbrite, I have your question. If you'd like to drop questions, you can use the chat function in your Zoom screen. You can also use the Q&A module at the bottom of your screen, and you can upvote, you can downvote, you can just do whatever you want in terms of those questions. I will be looking out for those while we chat, but we are super excited because finally we get to talk about all of the things. And Lexie, since you weren't part of that original conversation, I'm going to ask you to kick us off with your favorite moment from I Cheerfully Refuse.
Okay, well, we're going straight to spoilers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I have
The
been very patient. I've been patient.
the ending of the book,
Mm-hmm.
when Rainey says, I might even dance,
Mm-hmm.
I literally I hugged the book to my heart. I loved it so much. It was the perfect encapsulation of the entire journey he's been through, how it affected him. It just, oh, it was perfect. It gave me chills. I hugged the book. I loved it so much.
Oh, thank you. What a wonderful way to begin, right with me.
Uh-huh.
Perfect.
Uh-huh. This is how we read around these parts, Leif. This is how we do it. We get very attached both to the text and to the characters. And that also gives me the opening I was looking for because Rainey, our guy Rainey, he's as much of a character, obviously, as Lake Superior. You've always talked about the fact that you can't write a character that you don't want to know.
Oh,
And I
yeah.
want to talk about how Rainey came to you because it sounds like he kind of showed up fully formed, messy and slightly illiterate, but he showed
Yeah.
up pretty full formed.
Yeah, he did. He did. He was, look, I started writing this book the week that we went into lockdown.
Right.
And I think I needed a voice that was going to be one that I could invest in for the long haul,
Right.
because I'm not a fast writer. And and once I enter the tunnel of a novel, it's a long time before I come out again. So I wanted it to be the voice of someone that I could really enjoy hanging with for the next few years.
Mm-hmm.
And Rainey just showed up. I knew that it needed to be a Lake Superior novel set on a Lake Superior in a Lake Superior setting, and beginning in a small town up the shore from where I live in Duluth.
Right.
Um, and Rainey seemed large, he seemed quiet, he seemed upbeat and good-hearted,
Mm-hmm.
like a guy who, um, in his own, to begin with, illiterate way, uh, always tries to do the right thing,
Right.
tries to be an encouragement to the people around him, wears his heart on his sleeve a little bit. And people like that are, I think, really nice to be around.
Mm-hmm.
So it became a matter of getting up in the morning and going to my office, coming in here while it was dark, and um, and just letting him tell his story. And to the dancing part at the very
Mm-hmm.
end, the line that Lexi liked, um, that was in my mind for a long time because one thing a bass player never gets to do is dance.
Did his voice come to you first or the idea of who he was? Because he has such a distinct voice, but also he's this great big bear of a character. And I was so curious, what parts of him came to you first?
The two things came together, and the reason that happened, I think, is usually for me a novel starts out with a scene that I can't stop thinking about. And in this case, it was the scene in the library early on, 20 or 30 pages in, where Rainey goes because he needs a warm place to eat his cheese sandwich. And so he goes into the library in Duluth, and there while he's eating his sandwich, he hears the voice of a librarian. He can't even see her, but he hears her voice at the help desk, the information desk. And I loved the idea that he would fall for someone because of the way they sound. And the way that Lark sounds is kind. She's helping people to find whatever forms they need to fill out. But then what she's also doing is she is intuiting what these people who come to ask her questions about all kinds of things, what they need. She's a little bit like an Ann Tyler character, like in Dinner at the Homesick Restaurant or something, where the intuition guides the communication. And so, she recommends novels for a certain type of person. She recommends histories for ambitious people, poetry for heartbroken people. And all of this speaks to Rainey, who doesn't actually see her for some days, but begins to fall in love with her. And then the last thing he expected is that he falls in love with the act of reading itself, because he says to himself, as anybody would, if I'm going to have a chance with this girl at all, I have to know something about what she's talking about. And so he begins to read the books in the library, and so really it was that exchange, it was that scene. I imagined just this. I didn't know he was big until I wrote that scene, and then he's a hulking man trying to hide in a study carrel to eat a sandwich. There was something endearing to me about that. There was something incredibly endearing about the idea that a person could fall in love with someone because of their voice, having not seen them. And then, in order to impress them, would change his life, change his world, expand himself, and dive into something he's never done before.
And part of what I love about that, though, is you have set what you call a glorious romance against a very dystopian backdrop. But one of the things you give us, one of the clues you give us, is language. And the way your characters speak, there's a little bit of a Shakespearean cadence happening. There's a little bit of an old school Melville kind of thing happening. And I love the language, the vocabulary of the community, and the way language just sort of folds up on itself. Because that was sort of the first clue I had that things were not, a great dystopian sort of lets you know that enough is familiar, but then you start realizing that wait a minute. And I love the fact that that's where you started.
Yeah.
With these two people, and something that we all love, right? We all love to read. And then it just kind of goes completely into adventure story mode and everything else, and balancing that. So can we talk about sort of building that dystopian world, but also creating a language at the same time, because they're not necessarily the same thing?
Sure. Yeah. Rainey is, to begin with, self-educated until his late 20s. When that scene takes place, he could probably count the books he had read on one hand or two at the outside. He's quite late to the party. And then when he falls under the spell of sentences and paragraphs and pages, he is, I think, determined to make up for lost time. And I think the language that he uses, so his active voice, his eye for detail, maybe his narrative energy, that comes partly from his personality, which is, I would say, up tempo and curious, but it also comes from the novels and poetry and history and the science papers that have captured his attention. So Rainey is, more than anything else at this point, Rainey is a sponge. And when I was writing in his voice, I could feel his delight in a well-turned phrase or in a surprising verb. Those things were there for him, and I think that led to the development of his specific language. What you're talking about is, in some ways, just the familiar terms, for example, that he uses in a particular, sometimes subversive fashion. Quixotes, astronauts, patriots, and so forth. Mostly nouns that used to mean one thing, but which now mean something else, or have come to mean something else by the time he's using them. And that, in turn, I think, was incredibly helpful in in explaining the world that he lives in hinting at the world that he lives in. When did the word astronaut stop describing brave pilots that all of us were kind of proud to talk about, and start meaning something else?
Right.
I mean, I think we've all begun to watch that happen in front of our eyes, and so I think the language that I ended up using was something that was in a way shorthand, a shorthand for describing the world without having to go into too much explanatory detail
Hmm.
about how the world got this messed up. Um, I guess I could have gone there and explained it, but then it would have been a different kind of book, and it wouldn't have been very joyous for me to write. Instead, my approach was to make the most messed up world I could conceive of, and then drop a big love story into the middle of it, and see what happened.
Hey, Lexie, so you and I were talking about this sort of ongoing, we had this ongoing conversation, but what was the biggest surprise for you when you realized Leif Enger had written a dystopian novel? Like, because originally we were just like, hey, new Leif, of course, this is awesome. Let's start reading. And then you and I think, hit the same early moment. We were like, wait, what have we just gotten ourselves into? Which, as we all know, is a total delight. But do you remember what it was that made you go, wait a minute, what?
I mean, honestly, it was the language.
Yeah.
It was really the language. It was like, oh, something is going on here. But what I loved so much about the novel is that, and sort of going back to what you were saying about Rainey and Lark, is that this is a dystopia where care is still a thing that people do for each other. Like, this was unlike any dystopian novel I've ever read. It was so comforting to read about a world that doesn't feel that dissimilar from ours right now, but where it's still community driven. People are still taking care of each other. There's still joy, there's still pleasure, even though the world is kind of burning around us. And I wanted to know a bit more about the importance of community and care within the world of the novel and why you chose to write about a dystopia where these things still happen.
That's such a good question, Lexi. I think that I've always loved writing about friendships and about groups of people, who gather and have a meal or a birthday party or whatever it is that they do. I seem to write what I really need, and clearly what I needed at that point, as we all locked down, in the COVID months, was, I was just longing for a little company, and some people to eat with and laugh with, and so I took a lot of pleasure in writing those scenes. I I actually really enjoy writing about, the ways in which people do right by each other. There's no shortage of people doing wrong by each other, even in this story. There's a sort of generalized animosity, that some people have for others. Uh, but what was really fun in the midst of that was to point out, um, you know, the number of times that Rainey alone is a good Samaritan, is frankly impressive to me. And we're all presented with opportunities to do right, or to walk on by, um, on a daily basis. And it was really enjoyable to write about somebody whose default is is caring about whoever he meets. And sometimes that's not all that wise, you know.
Hmm.
You mentioned Miwa, calendar screen, and you going, oh no, something bad now is going to.
When Kellen rolled up to their doorstep, I did have a moment of, we need things to happen. I understand things need to happen. I suspect I am not going to like where we need to go because, again, the stakes are really high. I mean, if you take away a world, right? We've taken away the social contract. We've taken away sort of the world as we know it. How do you raise the stakes? So when you were plotting this out, Leif, were you working with the characters and sort of saying, okay, here's the umbrella of where I'd like to go, or were you just letting yourself be surprised on the
A
page?
little bit of each. I had
Okay.
I had three or four set pieces, in my
Mm.
imagination that I wanted to write, that I knew
Okay.
would spin the action in a little different direction.
Right.
And that was about as much planning as I did.
Right.
Kellen appears largely because I had recently reread an old favorite of mine, Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson,
Hmm.
and there's this old pirate that shows up at the inn at the beginning of the story, and he's just a pain, and he's drunk all the time, and he's violent, and he's kind of tearing everything up, and he's mean to people. But they give him a room, and of course they give him a room because he can pay for it, not necessarily out of the kindness of their
Right.
heart. But it's the people that come looking for him that end up really setting that book in motion, and it happens
Yeah.
very quickly. What I wanted to do with Kellen was introduce my own version of that, but have him be a sympathetic figure
Yeah.
and really use him to show what Rainey is made out of
Mhm.
and what Lark is made out of, and what it feels to me like if there's a solution to where we're at as a society, it's in people like Rainey and Lark who are willing to sometimes take the chance they shouldn't take,
Right.
who are willing to be Quixotes in a way,
Hmm.
and to be a little bit more idealistic than most of us are in actual life. But maybe something about the dystopian setting makes that not just possible but necessary. Maybe when we are really confronted with trouble and with a world that is markedly unfriendly, um, that might be a natural response. I hope we don't find out.
Yeah, I would like to listen when the zombie apocalypse comes. Peace out. I'm good. I've had a nice I do not.
I'm right there with you, Miwa.
Yeah, I know. Seriously, Lexie and I are just going to walk off with a pile of books and yarn, and we're just going to wave at everyone else and be like, "That's great. Thanks."
Like it.
You
Can
guys
I join you?
climb the yes, by all
You are
means.
so welcome to join us.
But I mean, the thing is, even though I would not like to be in this world for real, I loved reading this world and being part of it. Even when we got characters like the literal troll on the bridge. He's like, yeah, yeah, dude, you can't. And then the glasses and that sort of passive aggressive back and forth. I mean, we just keep meeting this cast and you don't know who's actually dangerous and who's not. And I really didn't want the book to end. I mean, I was constantly surprised. And Warwick, am I saying our bad guy's name properly?
Yeah,
Warwick.
Eric. Yeah.
So the thing about Warwick, when we first meet him, and there was a sense of menace to him, and I was not really thrilled, but I was like, okay, maybe he'll just be a polite weirdo. No, oh no, no, he is not a polite weirdo. But I want to talk about his evolution as a character because he's not fully he's clearly not a good guy, but he's also not a caricature. And
No,
that takes some work.
yeah. He was really fun to write about. I
Hmm.
enjoyed writing his character more than most because he starts out and he's clearly not exactly as he presents. In
Right,
that early scene, he comes into the bookstore. The fact that he finds the Molly Thorne book there, he asks what's under the counter. It's the Molly Thorne, and that is exactly what he was like looking for, but not for the reason that he lets on.
right.
That was his clue that he was near to Kellen.
Hmm.
But I think with Warwick, what had to happen for me was that I needed to see a little bit of how he came to be the monster that he is,
Right.
and that made him to me quite. There are scenes later on the ship where he summons Rainey to play bass for him.
Hmm.
It's happened several times
Yep.
because he is calmed by low notes, and by the bass lines that Rainey is capable of playing. And so I wanted that to have the feeling of sort of David and Saul scenes in the Old Testament,
Hmm.
where Saul is this troubled king, and he's mentally ill, and he's kind of off his rocker, and when he's really troubled, he knows what to do. He calls for the shepherd boy who can play the lyre, or
Right.
the flute or whatever, and David makes music and calms him down. I love that because it's David in the presence of his greatest enemy, um, doing this kind thing. And yeah, he doesn't have any choice in the matter. He has to do it.
Mm.
Um, but he does it with a spirit of kindness and and I was proud of Rainey that he could pull off what he pulled off there, which was to go in and look at this man who has ruined his life and taken Lark's life,
Mm-hmm.
and yet he can look at him as a human being. And I think that, as much as the music, is what allows Warwick to regain some measure of humanity. When that happened, then I felt like I had written a whole character.
So that's where I'm going to jump in with a question from Luke Rossamilia, building on what you just said. I'd be curious to learn more about Leif's use of spiritual and religious themes in this novel. They've been present more explicitly in his past works, and I still see them here and I cheerfully refuse, although more subtly so. Enger's stance towards organized religion feels much more cautionary here than in past books. I was curious if Leif would like to speak at all about his thoughts on what role he sees these elements as playing in the dystopian future.
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, look, one of the great Bible stories that everybody learns early on is the parable of the Good Samaritan. And in that, I don't remember the exact, I don't remember even which gospel it's in, but somebody asks Jesus, about, what do you have to do to be saved? And Jesus says, well, you have to love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. And then the question comes back, well, who's my neighbor? Who's which neighbor? What are you talking about? Um, and so then in response, Jesus tells this parable where there's a hurt man by the side of the road, and he's unconscious, and he's laying there, and he's wounded. He's been beaten by robbers, and he's been stripped naked, and it's a terrible situation. And so first a priest comes up the road, and the priest sees the guy, and he walks on past. And then the Levite, who's another religious leader, walks on past, just doesn't stop. And there are a lot of reasons not to stop. What if the guy's faking? What if there's going to be a lunge? Um, I can imagine not stopping. And then a Samaritan who was a despised Samaritan, comes up the road, and this guy isn't flying any particular religious flag, and he sees the man, and he checks his pulse, and he binds his wounds, and he puts him on his donkey, and he takes him into town, and he drops him off in an inn, and he takes care of him for as long as he can. And then when he has to leave, he says to the innkeeper, look, here's some money, take care of this guy. If it takes more than this, I'll be back to pay off the rest. In other words, he does the job. And then Jesus says, so who was the neighbor in that story? And it wasn't the one who's making some religious point. It was the one who does right by his neighbor. So the people who are most apt to claim religious motivations, they're not the hero of that story, and they're not the hero of my story either. I think that who's doing the will of God is probably the one who's looking out for their neighbor. So that's a really great question that the listener had, and their perception of my suspicion of organized religion is on the money.
Which also brings us back to Lark. And Lexie, you have a really great riff on Lark, and that's going to lead me to a comment from one of our audience members too. So, Lexie, let's come back to Lark, and then I'm going to work in some more stuff from the audience here. But would you tell folks how you're feeling about our girl? Because we had a lot of identification.
I mean, she's a bookseller. She's a
Right?
librarian turned bookseller.
About that.
And she's on this quest to find this book by Molly Thorne. And
Mhm.
one of my favorite parts of the book was, they have the advanced reading copy of it. And both she and Rainey are a little afraid to read it because they've been anticipating this book for so long. I was just like, this is perfect. This is exactly how it feels to love literature, to love authors. Um, and just all of the descriptions of her, how sort of sly and funny she is, but it always came back to how much she cared for people too, which just is one of the themes in this novel. And I love the idea of caring for people through books. That's what we do, Miwa. So
Right,
like
right.
obviously we really identified with her.
Totally. But the other thing that I love about Lark is the fact that she is willing to see Rainey beyond what's presented to her, right? Like he's this illiterate guy who's eating a sandwich kind of messily, like not knowing what to do with his body and space and time and all of that kind of thing. And she's like, yeah, but actually there's something here. And so he ends up getting on this path that he never would have been able to experience without her because she kept an open mind, which I thought was pretty darn cool. And then Roger Talbot dropped in a comment. It's just more of a comment than a question, but it's a really great line because it's quoting Leif. It was her habit when delighted to rise lightly on her tiptoe as if forgotten by gravity. And so Roger says, what a beautiful poetic thought written with simple precision. That sentence cemented my love for Lark. Thank you for it. So I just wanted to throw that in there because it is a great line, but it really does capture who she is. I mean, she moves through the world in an entirely different way. So I'm sorry, Leif, when you killed her, I got a little annoyed with you. Straight up, I'm not going to be polite about it. I was very, very mad. Even though my intellectual brain understood what had to happen for the story, I was just really mad because I'd
I
become
wasn't happy
so
about it
attached.
either. I
I
mean,
understand that, but I'm still mad at you.
fair enough. Fair enough. Uh, Fair enough. I've been confronted by a few readers at book events too, and I think that's absolutely a fair thing. The thing is, though, I mean,
Uh-huh.
that a book is there to do something.
Right. Right.
And what I really wanted, I mean, it would have been pretty easy to write like 1,000 pages about Rainey and Lark's day-to-day life, just because
Mm-hmm.
I liked being there. I
Yeah.
mentioned the world being kind of welcoming in its weird way,
Yep.
and it felt that way to me, and I kind of hated to finish for that reason.
I would read that book. I'm just saying.
Yeah, well,
I don't think we're alone. Also, Kristen Williams dropped in a comment too. The found family in this novel was supremely represented and one of my favorite parts of this reading experience. And I second that. I think just all of the people that we meet, even the ones that are nefarious and even the ones like the troll on the bridge, who just they want to live their lives and they just want to do their thing and be left alone to do their thing exactly as it is. And of course, that makes them entertaining. But the idea, again, and Lexi's hit on this a couple of times, that we can build a world and we can build community even when it feels like everything is lost,
yeah.
right? Like that, I mean, that really kept me going even when there were a couple of moments where I was holding my breath. I gave myself the hiccups, these things happen. But we have another question from Heather Johnson. I was curious about the theme of nature throughout. First, you have the names Lark, Rainey, Rainier, Saul, Sun, Thorn, Beezy, and there are a lot of references to sailing on Lake Superior, the weather. DDA starts working for the beekeeper. Saul begins gardening and tucking plants away all over town. The town name of Icebridge, the boat is named Flower. It all gave me a sense of hope in the beauty in life. And hope, I think, is something that we do need to come back to. And I do think nature, I think Heather has landed on a big point here, but I'm going to ask you, Leif, to answer that.
Well, look, um, I think I realized about halfway through that part of the reason I was enjoying this world so much
Hmm.
is because it is the opposite of the virtual world. It's the opposite
Right.
of um, uh, digital life. It's the opposite of screens, which of course here we are. Uh, but I found that to be incredibly healing, even just to think about it, even
Hmm.
sort of live there fictionally. And then also because it was the pandemic, and not to keep going back to that, but every day Robin and I would take walks, and Duluth has these beautiful streets, but normally you can't walk on them because there's traffic. You've got to walk on the sidewalk. But during the pandemic, it became this walking city. No one was driving. And so we would just go out and walk under the spreading trees. And I mean, you would encounter people at 6 feet away, and everybody was kind of lit up. Everybody was kind of happy. People were outside. They were listening to the birds. They were in touch with nature in a way maybe they hadn't been in a long time. There's a beautiful road called the Seven Bridges Road that winds through Duluth, and parts of that were just closed off to traffic, and people just walked. They just went there and walked. It felt great. The idea that we weren't online all the time was excellent, and I think that part of the hope that infuses this book has to do with the idea that that yes, maybe a lot of things have collapsed, but
Mm.
there are certain things that don't collapse. And those are the earth itself and the trees and the streams. The streams are going to keep running. You know, they might be dirty for a while. They might get polluted, whatever it is. But
Mm.
streams are going to keep running. The earth is going to keep growing things, and unless we totally spoil it. Um, and I think if we go out and we engage with that, that there is there's an inherent hopefulness in just being connected to that. So I think that's where the hope in the book really emerges from, is our connection to each other and our connection with the natural world.
Um, okay, we have a couple more comments, but Roger Talbot came back with a question. Listening here, everything is being expressed in terms of love and caring for each other, yet the world is in great turmoil. Were you hoping in this novel to give us instruction in the event such a dystopian world reaches us? It's not as unrealistic as many think. I mean, you have not written the Boy Scout handbook to the dystopian world. I mean, but it is an emotional roadmap of sorts, right?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I didn't think of it that way.
Okay.
What I thought was maybe a good way to imagine a dystopian future is by placing a very human love story in the center of it
Yeah.
and seeing how people respond. Um, love stories are another thing that don't go away just because we mess up the world.
Hmm.
We go to war, uh, or we pollute the lake, or whatever. There's still going to be love stories, and it felt to me like that. I mean, that's not a roadmap, um, but I needed to tell a story for myself of the redemptive qualities that are still available if we really mess things up.
You know, I want to sneak in something that you said to me the first time we hung out when we were taping Port Over. We were talking about nostalgia and optimism. And you have this really great approach to optimism. And you're kind of like, well, you know, if we're interested and we're paying attention and we're working hard, that actually kind of by nature makes us optimists. And I do feel like I Cheerfully Refuse is ultimately a very hopeful and very optimistic book because, yes, some of us lose our humanity, but not everyone does.
Well, yeah, exactly. I might have mentioned to you before too. I heard an interview with um, Kim Stanley Robinson,
Hmm.
who wrote The Ministry for the Future, a terrific book. And he was talking with, I think, Ezra Klein at the New York Times. And Ezra Klein, if it was he, um, asked about the hopefulness in that novel, which is it's a climate change novel. It's 600 pages long. It's a monster. It's terrific, and it's also inherently kind of hopeful. And what Kim Stanley Robinson said was some version of this, basically that hope is what keeps the landing strip clear for the muse. In other words, despair does not solve any problems. Despair doesn't write any novels. It doesn't make any artworks or good films. Despair is nothing that actually heals us or has a chance to make the world better. Only someone with a hopeful aspect, some optimism, can accomplish that. And so I really did want this book to reflect the optimism that I have personally, without being Pollyanna-ish. It has to, in order for hope to have any real impetus, any strength, any agency, it can't just be an easy hope that doesn't look the hard things straight in the face. I think you have to do that. And so that's one reason that things had to get as dark as they got. And when Lark dies, I was sidelined from the book for several days. I couldn't go any farther because um, I just couldn't bear it. I couldn't bear what had happened on the page. Um, but I think that it was necessary for Rainey to go through the worst imaginable thing, um, in order to see what he was made of, and in
Mm.
order to see if his hope would hold up. And so the fact that it does made me feel happy about him and
Mm.
happy about the book as a whole.
Yeah, we're getting lots of love again for Lark. Heather Johnson says, my favorite Lark scene was in the beginning when she arrives home to find Rainey in a melancholy Librino, and she begins dancing with Librino and brings him out of his funk, grabs his coat, and dances him to the door. And I'm like, oh yeah, that was really sweet. Like, we all have someone like that in our orbits, right? Where the person is just like, no, I know things are complicated and everything's hard, but it doesn't mean that we can't actually still live. And then Sherry Kaea, I hope I'm saying your name correctly, Sherry, but I'm laughing for a second because you said none of my personal predictions of the various characters were even close. And I'm just going to read this little list because this is pretty great. This book caught me totally off guard, and this is Sherry again. Kellen, often referred to as Rainey's little brother, which in my mind implies innocence. Two, Lark was a total shock. In fact, I had to reread her death to see if I caught it correctly. I agree with you. I had a moment where I was like, wait, did I just see that? And Lexie, I see Lexie doing this too. I love that couple, and it was such a loss. It took my breath away. It's a take one's breath away loss. And then the troll on the bridge was intense. See, I'm not the only one who was freaked out by the troll. I was stressing about how they were going to get out of there, and again, caught off guard as to how they did get out. And then Warwick, what a miserable wretch. His end was so fitting, but I sensed a little bit of like repentance in for him, sort of like he was feeling a little guilty about what he'd done. And I'm wondering, do you agree, Leif? Do you think he felt a little regret, Warwick, at the end of it all?
I don't know. I didn't think so. No,
Yeah,
I don't think he, no, I think maybe his humanity was pretty lost by the time he ends. Although I could still feel for him, and
hmm
I do. I mean, I love that character. Uh, Whereas the character of Skint,
yeah.
who was his muscle, I
Mm,
can summon no love for that character.
no,
You
that
know, I
was
try
bad
not
dude.
to write
Bad
any
dude.
characters that I don't love in some way or that I can't access.
Mhm.
Um, but Skint, I got nothing. I got nothing for him. No.
But also, I don't think Skint had anything left for anyone else either. I mean, he had his role in Warwick's orbit, but
Yeah.
I'm not sure he was a person anymore.
Yeah, he was full monster, I suspect.
Yeah.
Full tool.
Carolyn Boggs just dropped in one of her favorite lines from page 90. I only wanted to summon the size and shape and color of the joy in all caps we offhandedly accepted. What could be simpler than that? I mean, we are literally talking about the end of the world, ladies and gentlemen, and yet at the same time, it's just like, oh yeah, this is kind of great. People are surprising, right? Like we are, in fact, we're oddballs, but we are delightfully surprising. Leif, I sort of feel like you touched on this earlier, but what was the biggest surprise for you? I mean, because I know you do a lot of the writing in the rewriting, and I mean, you wrote the book. The original draft was what, 3 months or something, which for you is like may as well be running a marathon.
Right.
And then you took what, 2.5 years
Yeah,
to
yeah,
clean it up.
yeah,
So at
yeah.
some point, you had to say, "Hey, wait a minute, where did this come from?"
Oh, absolutely. Yeah,
Okay.
were two or three pretty big ones. One was that I was very surprised by how my own attitude toward Warwick changed
Yeah.
over the course of the book.
Yeah.
When he appeared, it was very much a calculation.
hmm
I knew that he was going to be a figure of evil and of real wreckage in their lives,
hmm
and so I brought him in. I wrote, you know, I wrote him as a clever um, sort of remnant of civilization, and I thought that that was a nice piece of misdirection.
hmm
Uh, what I did not expect was that I would start to look forward to writing his scenes because I I there was something about him that really attracted me,
hmm
and not that I would ever follow such a person or want to be around them in real life.
hmm
But I did want to know more about him. I do the Julia Cameron morning pages routine every day.
hmm hmm
I wrote dozens and dozens of pages just in Warwick's voice, just to try to understand him and see where he had been and what had made him the way he was. Um, and that was a nice surprise. You know how people are. You mentioned Miwa, how people surprise you and how we are all surprising ourselves sometimes.
hmm
Um, I rarely go into a situation, a room full of strangers, where I am not surprised by someone. And sometimes they are people that I just don't anticipate that I'm going to
Mhm.
enjoy. That I think, well, we probably have zero in common, whatever it might be, whatever tips me off. You know, but if I just talk to them for a few minutes, it's very rare that I don't come out liking them.
Right.
Uh, people are people are likable, even people that I would probably disagree on pretty much any topic you could name.
Mhm.
Um, People are just likable. We're just kind of likable creatures.
Right.
And the same thing happens when I'm writing a character. And sometimes it's worth just going into the morning pages and just letting them spill
Mhm.
out and letting them talk to me in whatever voice they have. And the same thing happens. I begin to think, oh, I kind of like this. I kind of like this person. I kind of
Mhm.
like, and then I feel like I can risk putting them in the book.
I love that idea. Lexi, you have mentioned a couple of different things that you keep coming back to when we're talking to booksellers in the field about this book, and when you're just talking to people in and around our orbit about this book. You have a couple of different things that you really just can't shake, and I'm hoping you'll share them here with folks.
I mean, ultimately, this was a book that like I wanted to climb inside of and live in. I was so sad when it ended. The community that was created in this novel, there was something really just magical about it. And it, to experience the end of the world as a place that is still community driven, that there's still pleasure, that there's still joy, such a hopeful book. I every time I put it in someone's hands, I was like, you are going to want to climb inside this book and just curl up and live there. And everyone who read it agreed with me. It just, you've created this world that is unforgettable and so welcoming, even though it's the end of the world.
Well,
Right?
thanks. Um, I alluded before to how long it takes me to write a book, and part of if anybody asks me a question about how to write a novel,
Mm-hmm.
I assume that they're going to be slow, like I am. And so my advice is always write about people that you can love, and write about a place that you never want to leave. Uh,
Right.
you might, you just increase your chances of sticking the landing. If you can write about a place you love and people that you want to be around. Thank you.
Okay. We have one character reference and then a couple of questions, and then we are going to bump into time. So, as much as that would be the perfect place to wrap this, we're not going to do that. We're going to get to it a little bit more. Kristen Williams wants to shout out Saul. We've spoken a lot about Lark, and I was gutted as well by that loss. But Saul, she brought grit and courage and strength to this narrative that I adored. Can we talk about our little girl for a second? Because she really is a little girl. She's not, you did not make her a 40-year-old voice in a tiny
No,
person's body.
no, I didn't. And she was tremendously enjoyable to write. I knew that there was going to be a child.
Hmm.
I knew that was coming. The closer he got to, I knew it was going to happen right after he gets blown across the lake in that tremendous storm. He heaves to, and he is slowly blown across Lake Superior and to the Michigan shore. And I knew that the first person he saw there would be the child. But I let it surprise me. I let the scene just surprise me, and it turned out to be just a little slight girl carrying a fish spear, a sort of trident, which I also loved for its kind of mythological origins. Um, but this girl hunting fish in the shallows of Lake Superior. And then at the moment I saw her, then I knew that I was onto something. And she did turn out to be, she brings back a lot of the light that is
Mm.
snuffed out when Lark leaves the story. In some ways, she is a continuation. She's a nod to the future
Hmm.
as well as a nod to the past. And when he sort of takes on the job of reading to her and
Hmm.
introducing her to the joys of story and teaching her how to write her name, although she fears the pencil. She doesn't want to touch the pencil. It's like an instrument of magic, and she has been told that that's something she shouldn't do. For me, a key moment in the book comes when he receives a note, when they're on the ship and he receives a note from Saul. And it's nothing except her name. He's tried to teach her to write her name. She's resisted doing it. And when she finally learns to write her name and she sends him a note with that name written on a slip of paper, that to me was, at that moment, I knew that the book was going to turn out in a way that would please me. Before
Okay.
that, I was
That was a moment that every person who read this book, when they got to that point, they came to talk to me about it because it is just perfect. It perfectly encapsulates the world you've created where these simple things still bring such joy, such excitement, such pleasure. It was just such a wonderful moment.
thank you.
And okay, two last questions. So, where does the inspiration for adding the thread of music, Rainey's bass and the quality of the sound, and the fact that he trades his bass guitar, excuse me, for to save Saul? Where does all of that music come from?
Well, really, it comes from experience because for 15 years, I played electric bass, and my brother-in-law was a pastor for many years, and he asked me to be the bass player for his church band, and I did that, and it was really fun. I didn't know how to play bass until he taught me, um, and and the first lesson he said was first do no harm, and I loved that because that's actually great life advice. Is first look specifically bass wise. What it means is play one note at a time, lock in with the drummer, don't disrupt the groove, don't try to be the star. You're the bass player. Your job is to stand in the shallows and build a foundation on which the rest of the song can exist. And so, what I loved about that for Rainey is that he is no one's idea of a leading man, a protagonist, the hero of the story. He doesn't view himself that way at all. He's a bass player. He's the guy who plays the foundational notes that you don't really hear. Listen to your favorite band sometime and see how difficult it is to hear the bass player. And yet there they are building that foundation. The song can't exist in a fulfilling way without the bass line moving things along. And so I love that sort of out of public view kind of person telling the story. And I don't think I ever would have thought about that or about the musical aspect if I had
Hmm.
in the church band all those years. A terrific experience.
Okay, and before I let Lexie take us out, one more question. How has your writing process evolved throughout your writing career, if it has at all?
Oh yeah. Well, when I was working for Minnesota Public Radio, I didn't have as much time to write as I have now. So I would get up at 4:30 or a quarter to five, and I would write from five until seven, and then I'd go off to my regular job. But then after Peace Like a River came out, I was able to leave that. What I do now is I still get up early. I do some morning pages. I have breakfast with Robin. And then I come up to my office and I just spend a normal day. I write until lunchtime. I have a sandwich. I come back up and I write until five or six, or if it's really going well, seven.
Hmm.
Um, so I mean, I spend a lot of time at it. I treat it like a full-time job, which it is. But it didn't used to be that way because I had
Hmm.
a different full-time job. I don't have a fascinating poetic answer for that question. I'm I come and pour the words onto the paper.
Yeah, but we get pretty great novels out of the not poetic answer, so I'm good with it. Hey, Lexi, what do you want Barnes& and Noble Book Club members to know about your experience of I Cheerfully Refuse that maybe you haven't yet alluded to? And the answer might be no, I've said all the things, but I have a sneaking suspicion there's a little more.
It's just a book that you walk away from feeling hopeful. This is a
Hmm.
book that really is about the best of humanity in the worst of circumstances. And I finished the book and just felt so hopeful. These are challenging times that we live in. And to read this book about people facing even more challenging times than we are, that are able to form these communities that still care about each other, it just warmed my heart. It filled me with hope. It's a book that you will leave it feeling so wonderful about the world and hopeful. So I hope that all of you will pick it up.
All right, and there's one last question that just snuck in that I'm going to ask because it's fun. How did you choose the title? Asked Julia Orgill.
Oh, well, there were two things. First was that I wrote it at a time when it felt to me like we were, as a country, heading in a lot of wrong directions. Um, and so what I wanted to refuse was ignorance. I wanted to refuse ignorance if curiosity is available instead. I wanted to refuse despair. And so it was those two things. And then also I had recently reread Bartleby the Scrivener, who always says, I would prefer not to, which struck me as just a glorious response to our times in general. So I thought, well, I'll just update that ever so slightly and use it. And then it was a great title to write toward, and it was my working title and my finished title.
And it's a great title, and it's a great book, and the characters are amazing, even the ones that we don't love. So this is where I'm going to say thank you, Lexie Smyth. As always, I will see you upstairs in a few minutes. And thank you, Leif Enger, because this was just really fun. It's always great to see you. Thank you, audience. We'll be back next month with Rachel Kong and Real Americans, and I hope you'll join us then. Thanks all. Have a great day.
Thanks, both of you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.